lots of wisdom today. So can I ask Christian for you to introduce yourself first?
Hello, my name's Christian. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I previously worked in the hemato-oncology department at King's in South London.
Thank you very much. And Kirsty?
Hello, my name's Kirsty. I'm the myeloid advanced nurse practitioner at the Churchill Hospital, and I've worked in haematology oncology for a long time.
Thank you very much. And Vid, yourself?
Hi, it's Rich, and I was diagnosed with polycythemia vera last August.
Fantastic, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today. I know there's a lot for us to talk through. And tonight we'll be covering one of the biggest stages in a blood cancer experience, and that's somebody's diagnosis with blood cancer, but recognising that adjustment to change and recognising kind of what's needed after a diagnosis it is really important and can last different lengths of time for different people. But there are other key periods of anxiety as well in someone's journey that we understand, such as starting treatment, but also maybe less obviously returning home after treatment when somebody enters remission, or establishing a new normal while living with the long-term condition. So there's lots of different areas that we want to cover, and we've got lots of questions to get through. But if anyone who has registered with us and is joining us via Zoom wanted to ask a particular question, then please do drop it in the chat here. Just to note that we won't be able to comment on specific clinical queries, but we'll try and cover any themes that come up in the chat where possible. Anyone who's joining us on social media, that's absolutely fine for you to ask questions as well, but you'll likely have those questions answered quicker if you contact our support services team via our phone line on 0808 2080 888, or email us on support@bloodcancer.org.uk, and we will get back to you as quickly as possible. Before we get on to the questions that we'd planned to ask a couple of days ago around adjusting to change, it feels like it wouldn't quite be right to not touch on the many changes that have happened within government guidance over the last couple of days as well, and around COVID vaccines that people are having to adjust to. This is another massive change alongside all of the other elements of somebody's experience that we've outlined. So I just wanted to be clear on some of the changes that we're aware of so far, noting the fact that there is still some uncertainty and lots of questions are coming through to us already about some of these things. So we're updating our health information as quickly as we can, and trying to get answers and clarity from the government about some of those areas. So just to outline a couple of things. So everybody living with a blood cancer will be identified by either their GP or treating team over the coming days and weeks to receive a letter inviting them for a third dose of their primary course of the vaccination. We know some people have received these letters already, but lots of people are still waiting. And it might take a little longer for these to be sent out, but it should happen over the next couple of days and weeks. And the reason for those third doses is that for many people with blood cancer, the vaccine provides less protection against COVID due to the impact their condition or their treatment has had on their immune system. And so while we know a second dose of the vaccine increases antibody response for many, we anticipate this will be even more effective with a third dose. But we do know that for some people this might not work, so we do need clarity from the government about more support provision and timelines on rollout of alternative protections as soon as possible. And the second point that I just wanted to be clear on is that household members of people who are immunocompromised are also included in the first priority group for the government's booster programme as well. So people living in the same household as somebody with blood cancer should also be provided with a vaccination as part of the booster rollout, which is really good news. But there's still lots of questions around vaccine efficacy, so please do visit our website, and there's lots and lots of information there, and get in touch with us if you need to. So I just wanted to clarify those 2 points before we moved on to some of our questions. But actually, I think something that's coming through loud and clear for us is a question around managing change to the government guidance about vaccines and around coronavirus more generally. So I wanted to start with Christian and just kind of summarize some of those as somebody saying, I feel like I'll never stop being vulnerable again, and how can I adjust to my life potentially never being quite the same as I anticipated pre-pandemic?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think something that's really difficult to sit with, or can feel really difficult to sit with. One of the first things I think it would be important to point out is anxiety, our kind of internal threat system. It's really triggered by uncertainty. It's why children are scared of the dark, because you don't know what's there. And for the last year and a half, the whole world's been in this position where we're being told to be afraid and that there's something bad. We're being told that we don't quite know what it is, that we don't quite know how to protect you or how to protect yourself. So it's natural that everybody's anxiety should and will be that bit higher. And if you've got something additional, then that makes it all the harder to tolerate. I realize that that's not very helpful, saying, oh yeah, well, it makes sense, you should be feeling really anxious. But I suppose it feels important to acknowledge that this isn't someone being silly or difficult, or it's how we're programmed to respond. And sometimes reminding yourself of that can be helpful, to give yourself a second to take a breath and step back and think about, what is it that the anxiety wants me to do, and what do I as an individual want me to do? Because emotions are fabulous servants but terrible masters, and if you end up having to try and satisfy the anxiety, you can get to a point where you're trying to do more and more and more to try and make yourself feel safer and safer and safer, but actually the anxiety is just growing. So I suppose that's important to think about, to give yourself a bit of a gap and say, okay, what do I want, and what feels sensible to me, and what am I doing that's satisfying my anxiety? I think you also made a really interesting point about how do I feel about myself as someone who will never feel safe again, or never not feel vulnerable. And that's one of the things with kind of conditions that can go on for a long time, is that there's this constant readjustment about who you are as a person. I think that often what can be helpful is to go back and think about your values as an individual. So one of the ways that you can often try and tap into those values is, this takes a bit of imagination. Imagine it's your 90th birthday and all the people you love most in the world are there, and they're all going to stand up and make a speech about you, and everything they say is going to be true, and it's everything you'd most want to hear people saying about you, but it's all going to be true. And for some people it might be, she was kind, she was clever, she was organized, she was great at running. It will vary for different people, but those things that you want to hear people who are special and dear to you say, that often gives us a clue about what our value base is, about what things are important to us. And there's a whole evidence base that says living as close as possible to those core values is what gives us happiness, is one of the things that makes us feel good. So I'm someone who's vulnerable. That doesn't mean, or I'm someone who can feel more vulnerable than I used to. That doesn't mean that you're not the same person that you were, who has those core values around, for example, being a great friend. They don't have to, it doesn't have to be one or another. But sometimes that feeling of, I'm someone different now, there's a fear that we've lost the bit that we really liked about ourselves, and it can be helpful to go back and remind yourself that you are still that person, you're just a slightly different version of it at the moment.
Thanks, Christian. And I think a really interesting way to kick off some of those questions, because I can imagine that's probably a theme that will run through quite a large part of this this session today. So thank you for outlining that. I wanted to move on now to a question that came through from somebody who'd recently been diagnosed. And they've said, I feel like everything my clinical team says to me is in a completely different language. My partner is there to support me, but neither of us have any medical knowledge. I'm not a scientist. I can't even pronounce my disease name properly. I don't understand what's going on. And just asking some advice about what can I do. So I wanted to come to Kirsty first, and then Vidge after that, to get some kind of personal experience and insights. But Kirsty, from your professional experience as a nurse, how would you respond to that question?
I think that's such a valid question, because in haematology, nothing is short. They're all huge, big words. And I have to admit, after all these years, I still spell a lot of them wrong, and I still struggle to say the myeloproliferative. I have to work myself up to say it. So when we were talking about polycythemia vera, I do tend to say PV and shorten things. But a big part of what I see as my role, or what I see as the clinical nurse specialist role, is really to provide information and to be able to signpost people to good information, and just to say this. You don't really need to know to begin with. It's not vital to know exactly what the term is. It's more, let it settle in, let you get used to this new diagnosis. These things will come. The greater understanding, being able to pronounce it will come with time. You're just not going to be able to do that straight off. It took me ages when I first came into myeloid to pronounce everything. So it will come. But what's important is letting it bed in, I guess, and knowing that there are options there are people there that can help, that it will take people different lengths of time. You know, some people pick it up really quickly, other people don't. Other people, they need different types of information. So it's been able to signpost, so it's been able to identify somebody that will help make that diagnosis more tailored to you. And that's a big part of our role, finding out how that information, because I'm a visual person, you give me a big booklet, I'm not going to read it. So I ask, how do you want this information? Do you want me to send you some stuff in an email? Do you want me to direct you to some links, some charity links? So I tend to ask people what information they want and when they want it, because the worst thing we do is we look at diagnosis is, here's all of this information, and pile it on people, and then that's just overwhelming. So it's often, what information do you want and when? If you don't want it now, I'm here, you can come to me, but also managing the expectations a little bit and saying, I can't reply straight away, but I will get back to you and I will be able to respond. So it's saying that that's all right, that's absolutely all right. You don't need to be able to pronounce it. Let's get this new you into perspective first of all, and then the learning can come, and then the understanding can come with time.
Thanks, Kirsty. I think that the time it takes for people to adjust is a very individual thing, but I think, as you say, kind of reassuring people that it doesn't have to be immediate. You don't have to be an expert in your own condition in the first couple of days.
Absolutely, and it can be reinforced. It can be said, the same thing can be said over and over and over and over and over and over again. It doesn't matter. And if it takes you 2 years, there's no timeline in these things. And the information is out there. We've got great information now. So the information is out there that people can then look at it in their own time and have the ability to ask questions.
Thank you, Kirsty. Vidge, would you respond in a similar way? Would you agree with Kirsty from your personal experience? How would you respond to that?
I was a bit like the Churchill dog at the back of the car, just nodding to everything Kirsty was saying, because it is so true. Like when I was diagnosed with poison, I was diagnosed over the phone because of COVID. I wasn't able to go to a hospital, and when the hematologist spoke to me and said I've got polycythemia vera, I was like, I think first thing was like, he didn't even mention the cancer word. It was more of a case of just asking him to spell it, because then I could then go on to research, because everything else was just a fog. All he knew, I had a condition, and then started talking about that it's manageable, and that's all I heard. I thought, right, okay, this sounds serious. And obviously on the letter, when I received the the appointment, it did say melanoma and cancer department, and I think that's when it hit home. I was kind of expecting all clear, but then I thought, right, well, okay. And it was only until I started researching online did the cancer come in. It is, like I said, it is really overwhelming with the sort of acronyms and a lot of the medical team do speak. And exactly like Kirsty said, it's because of spelling and how much time it takes, and it doesn't roll off the tongue as nicely. But it is such a learning curve. I've been diagnosed for like a year, and only now I'm starting and I'm taking an active role in my condition, and then now slowly started to learn and read my blood tests, etc. But it's so important that you kind of understand that it is a whole different ball game, and it does take time to learn these things. And I think the more you learn, the more you interest you in, and then the more you then start understanding what it is that you're going. It is quite overwhelming, and I think it kind of leads in segue to the booklet that Blood Cancer have just released, which goes through, and I'm hoping that a lot of the haematologists, when people are first diagnosed, do get this booklet, because it just feeds you into all those questions of what information do I need to take. And I think what is difficult and what people don't understand is it is really overwhelming, but it's really important to understand and take time to let it sink in and write down all your questions down, because when you start sharing your diagnosis with other people, they are going to have so many questions, and it is really overwhelming to be able to answer their questions as well as your own. So be in a position where you are able to understand what it is, so then you can then go on to answer those questions. And if it means then you seem a little bit dim of not knowing what words to say, just admit it to your clinical team and medical team, saying, look, can you just break this down? I'm not medically trained, and be honest. And I think you'll appreciate, and they will appreciate that honesty if you say that right from the offset.
That's such a good point, actually. Sorry to interrupt, but
yeah, no.
Back to your clinical team, that's what they're there for, and use them and ask questions, because we do use all these big words, and we do need to break it down a little bit just to see this was write it down. One of my professors is great. He always draws a diagram or writes things down so that people can take it away, and it just helps. It just helps break down this huge big word to you, to help you deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, one of the things
course.
I noticed working in haematology is there often felt like my colleagues really see themselves as being there to help and serve the patients, but quite often the people I was working with, I almost had to convince them to give themselves permission to be able to ask the questions they wanted and to be able to focus on the bits that were important to them, and that this is your team. And if this is the thing that's really worrying you at the moment, or that you really want to focus on, then they're not going to know that unless you tell them, and they will be more than happy to make that their focus. You've just got to be a bit brave. And I think sometimes the power dynamic that people imagine can make them feel a bit timid, but this is, we are your team, we want to support you, and you have to give yourself permission to be able to kind of share that and own that.
I completely agree with that. I completely agree with everything that's been said. And our support team at Blood Cancer UK regularly has contact with people who have an appointment coming up but don't know what to ask. Or should I ask this question? Is this a stupid question? I should know this by now. Do I need to ask it? Can you just tell me? And there are some pieces of information and support that we can provide, but a large part of our role is just to support and empower people to be ready for that appointment or that conversation, and to help people recognize what is important to them to get out of that conversation. Vidge, did you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I think what is important, because obviously I'm a teacher, and I think the doctors want to be understood. And because they're so used to speaking with other medical professions, I think sometimes they forget of who they're speaking to. But also that if you are medically trained, it is easier to speak to, because obviously cancer does hit medically trained people. And it's just telling them where to start the information. And for me as a teacher, if I knew I want to be understood, that's my main objective, is to be understood with what I'm saying. So if I'm told right at the start where to pitch it, it helps me massively. And I'm sure from the doctors and hematologist side, just being that honest certain offset will just make everyone's job easier.
And no question's a stupid question. I am the queen of stupid questions, but then I worry about the small things that are the stupid questions, and I deal with the bigger things. So no, I always say that no question's a stupid question. It's a question, and it has to be answered, because then you don't worry about it. Then you are informed. And all of these questions and the more information that people are gathering is giving control back to a situation they have no control over for a while. So no question's a stupid question.
And I really enjoyed the plug of our new health information booklet as well, almost perfectly timed, quite succinctly together. Exactly.
I won't say what page I'm in, but yeah.
So Vidge and Kirsty are both part of our working groups to help develop that piece of health information. And as Kirsty said, there can be a lot of information provided when somebody's first diagnosed. And this piece of work is actually looking to reduce some of that overwhelm, to be able to provide people with what you need to know now, but also the fact that reassuring people that there's plenty of time to absorb more of that information, and importantly hearing stories from other people who've been in a similar situation to yourself, and getting some advice and guidance from them. So really useful, and I would really recommend downloading that or ordering that from our website. We'll copy the link into the post after the session. I'll move us along just briefly. We also had quite a few questions, and I've spoken to a number of people as well on the support service who've been diagnosed recently and feel like they themselves are managing everything. They're able to speak with their clinical team. They feel like they are in control to an extent, but they feel very much like they don't want to bring their family into that. They don't want to share things with their family. So Christian, I was going to come to you on this question, with people asking, should I tell my parents, or I can't face telling my children, I don't want to worry them. What would you say to somebody in that situation?
Oh, I'm muting myself. First of all, I think this is hugely individual, and I know I sound like a politician when I say, well, it depends, but it really does. I think taking away the should is a good idea, because there is no should. There isn't a roadmap for how you do this. As Kirsty mentioned, one of the things that can be quite difficult for people is they can kind of end up feeling like dust in the wind, because things are being done to you, and although you're consenting, it's not really something that you're having control over, or you've got an active choice in. And again, it's about giving yourself a permission that this is your information and you don't owe anybody else an explanation. So if you don't want to tell people because you don't want them to know, then I think that that's your call. I think there sometimes can be sounds similar, but a significant difference if your desire not to tell other people is because you're worried about having to look after their emotions. I don't want to tell my children because you don't want to upset them. Is it because you're worried that you can't tell them that everything's going to be okay and you want to be able to? Is it that you're worried that they're not going to be able to cope and you're not going to know how to fix it? Is it because you're worried and you haven't been able to think about that yet? And there's often an experience that if I don't tell anyone, it's not quite real. Once I've verbalized it or I've admitted it, I make it something real, and I'm not sure I want to do that. And again, that's hugely individual and depends on the person. I suppose understanding your motivation for why you do or don't want to tell people might lead you to do exactly the same thing with 4 different people who you don't want to tell for 4 different reasons, but at least again, you've got the control and you know why it is you do or don't want to do it. I would also suggest, depending on what services are available where you are, this is exactly the type of thing that psychologists or counsellors can be a really good space to go through that with, because they're people who know what's going on. On the whole, we're kind of quite nice, quite empathetic, but you don't have to worry about upsetting them. You can talk through those difficult feelings, see what it feels like to verbalize it, and it can be quite a safe space to do that. On more than one occasion, there have been people I've been working with, and after a few sessions, they felt more enabled to tell people because they know that there's a service who can support those people. I'm less worried about telling my 15-year-old son, because actually if he needs something, I've already got in my mind what's available to support him, so I don't feel like I'm just throwing them off a cliff.
I think kind of understanding motivations is a really important part of that. Christian, thank you. Vidge, did you have anything you wanted to share around your personal experience and any advice for anybody who's going through something similar?
Yeah, to be honest, this really touches home. I think of all the sort of topics that we were going to discuss today, this one really hit me home, simply because I've not told my family about my diagnosis. It's been, over a year now. It's critical me coming online and being broadcasted. But because of the support and help I've had from Blood Cancer UK, I just had to pay it forward, really. Yeah, so it was quite surreal in terms of making that decision. I was very close, because I think when you've been told and you find out that you've got a form of cancer, it's very easy for you to tell. I think I had a phone call from my sister asking me how the appointment. She was aware of the appointment, and I think I asked her, I've got. They've told me something, but I don't want my mum and dad knowing at this moment in time. And she says, if you can keep it a secret, then that's fine. She says, I don't think I'll be able to keep that from them. And I was like, well, okay. She kind of took me back. And I thought, right, well, then I'm not going to tell you. And the reason for that is because I've lost a sister to cancer 5 years ago, and hers was really aggressive. From her diagnosis to when she passed away was about 8 months. So cancer hits harder in our family, and and I thought, well, okay, until I've got my head around what type of cancer this is, because I think people have got this idea of what it is. And for me, I wasn't aware of blood cancer. When I hear blood cancer, I think of tumours. I think of things that can be removed. And you think to yourself, blood cancer, how are they going to take my blood? Are they going to just simply replace it all, or what happens and how fatal is it? And it is quite scary to hear blood cancer, to be honest. But then through my research, and when I understood my condition and I spoke to my haematologist and did a bit of research, I realised what the prognosis was going to be. And although it's not curable, which is never nice, it is definitely manageable. I thought, well, okay, then let's see how this goes and contain it, because I knew that, like I said, everyone has this image of what cancer looks like. And if I'm not going to go through those sides, if people physically can't see me going through that, then maybe I can just bide my time until I get an understanding of, like, as I mentioned earlier, about being able to answer those questions that they are going to ask me, like the two questions, how long have you got? And I think people need to be aware and be prepared of people's reaction. Like, I've recently read a post on the Blood Cancer UK forum, which actually had this discussion of people's reaction to cancer. And I think people who have been diagnosed have this preconception of how they want other people to react. And when people don't react in that way, whether it be friends or family members, it messes with your mind, and it can cause sort of brick walls to be built, and it makes it a little bit awkward. And but yeah, and I think people who are aware of their reactions, but the first questions were, I remember when I told a few people, I was proper analysing what their reactions were, and it took like a day or so, and I thought, do you know what, I wasn't too happy with how that came across or how that is. And I think, but being on the other side of hearing someone being diagnosed with cancer and how I would react to it, I tried vividly to remember how I reacted. I think I was at work when I had a phone call when my sister told me that my other sister had cancer, and I was like, okay, I'll be there as soon as I can. And I just gave her a massive hug. And I don't know if that was the best reaction. I have no idea. I didn't really have that conversation with my sister of, did action kind of tick that box of what she was after. Also, the fact that I know there's no good cancers or bad cancers, and I think what's difficult is people. I think what I've got is not necessarily a bad cancer. It's not a bad cancer. Like, I wanted to understand what type of cancer it was, but what I wanted is for them to recognize my cancer is comparable to how other people have gone, or how other treatments have gone, or how people are suffering with all the different types of cancer. This is my cancer, and I wanted to get an idea of what it was I was going through before saying. So, to be fair, my sister saying what she did, although I didn't like her at the time when she said it, I'm actually really, really thankful, because I'm in control of this condition. And although I'm able, and I'm fortunate enough to be able to be in control of this.
Vidge has, I think, maybe had some internet connection issues, so has left us, hopefully temporarily. But I think he was making some really good points there, just around his own reflections about how he wants to kind of stay in control of his diagnosis, and who he wants to tell, and what he wants to and how he wants to shape that connection and relationship with others. If Vish, you're back, which is good to see you. I hope everything's all right. I will move us on though, just mindful of time. Just to so the next question is around just managing during the pandemic, and thinking actually just really poignantly to Vij's situation as he explained it, that the diagnosis came during the pandemic, and people are questioning kind of how they could potentially return or begin to return to normal once they do start to feel a little bit more comfortable. Somebody saying, I know I'll feel incredibly anxious even thinking about seeing people again, let alone going back into a shop or a cinema, but I don't want to be a hermit forever. I know people are in different places with how comfortable they feel, but people looking for some advice with that. Kirsty, can I come to you first? Just I'm sure you've got many of these questions coming to you in your clinical setting.
Yeah, it's so difficult because I think it's the first time in my career in haematology where we don't have answers, if that makes sense. You know, everything else, all the other treatments we've put into practice, everything else we have research evidence, and we know this is how X amount of people have responded to it. And this has been, for me, probably the most difficult time because it's really difficult to make people feel safe during all of this uncertainty, and it's really difficult to minimize the risk to people when we don't really know the risk. And all I've been saying is that I think people have to maintain, I'm do what I'm doing, I guess, is so that I'm still safe going in to see my patients. And it's making sure if I'm seeing anybody that they've been really well, that I'm keeping my distance, wearing masks. I'm still limiting where I'm going to. I'm still wearing a mask everywhere I go. I'm still fanatical about hand washing. And I think that's so that I know that I'm still able to go in and see the patients that I'm managing. And I think it's so difficult because a lot of people with any diagnosis, regardless of whether it's a good diagnosis or a bad diagnosis, for some people this could be the last year of their life, and then to limit their exposure to their people that they love is severely impacting on their quality of life. And I sometimes have had to be a little bit pragmatic about it and say to people, actually, we're in a situation where we're not going to be able to cure this. We're not going to be able to help you. You need to go and see your family. You need to get those pleasures out of life that you're not going to get otherwise. And for other people, it's trying to minimize risk, and that involves real individual talking to patients. And that's what we've had to do a lot, is tailor it to individuals. And that was every time there's new news comes out, there's an increase in the calls and the anxiety. And I totally understand that, because I feel that anxiety because I think I don't know how to answer this all the time. And so I've had to say it's been as safe as we possibly can while still trying to get the enjoyment out of life, because turning into a hermit just makes this much worse for you. But I get that it's still very scary out there.
Mm-hmm. That is mirrored almost entirely with our support services as well, Kirsty, and just really interesting to see the difference in levels of anxiety as things change. But actually then the calls seem to be more about how do I manage this change, and what does life look like now. Christian, I wondered if you wanted to come in on any of that, any of your patients kind of adjusting to the change the pandemic has caused.
Yes, absolutely. I think what Kirsty was saying was really similar to lots of the conversations I've had with people. If we take away the pandemic or any kind of blood disorder, anything like that, we all make choices all the time about what we can do that keeps us safe and what we can do because we get some enjoyment out of it. You'd be much more sensible not driving a car, not getting on a plane, not leaving your flat, but you'd be safer, but you'd be miserable. And I don't mean to make this sound flippant by taking the other things away. I appreciate that this is a much more anxiety provoking situation, and it's much more difficult and it's much harder to balance. I suppose my reason for saying we do this all the time is a number of the conversations I've had with people of where they felt that it's impossible, and how can they possibly make a sensible decision. And I've often found that that's the point where people start shutting down and turning into a bit of a hermit and losing joy from life. And so that's the bit that actually you can do this, and it is difficult, and you can do it. And again, it's the two things existing side by side, that you're always having to we always make calculated risks. And I think what Kirsty was talking about finding those things, seeing your family, going out, getting that pleasure and joy from life, that can't be minimized how important that is. And that's not the same as being reckless or not taking precautions or anything like that. But the payoff for what you get for taking some of those risks, for some of the risks that we take all the time, is, I suppose, what makes life worth it.
Vidge, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think I always picture it as like a seesaw. And in order for you to have fun on the seesaw, you need to go up and down. And it's no fun if you just stay on one level, whether it's at zone or like that. So I think it's a bit like that. I think for me, I was anxious, I was really nervous, and I was feeling depressed. But then there was times when I was out and I was like, you know what, I'm really enjoying myself. And then there was times where it wasn't in control. I think I felt happiest when I was in control of the situations that I was with. I knew where I was, and whenever I felt uncomfortable, I had the control of not being there. And I think that's one. But I think like everyone has said, it's about that finding that balance, finding that compromise of ups and downs, but recognizing it is relaxing stuff.
Absolutely, and maybe something within that around working out what it is that triggers maybe some of those ups and downs as well. And I think what we've heard in the past, feedback that we've got, is actually having some of that clear information or clarity about information, that things that we do know, things that we still need to find out, is useful for people. Having those conversations as much as you can with your clinical team or your GP, but also with the support services or friends or family, somebody trusted, who you can talk to about the issues, is also really important to have a level of control back.
And I think it's as well, see with the seesaws, they're to be expected. It would happen. It happens in normal life. So it's going to happen when you get a diagnosis. There's going to be periods where you're due for bloods. There's that mild panic before the night before the bloods are due. What's the consultant going to tell you? And a lot of the time your rational head knows the consultant's not probably going to tell you very much, and it'll be a really quick call, but there's still that devil on your shoulder saying, oh no, it's all going to be bad. And it's being able to accept that, and also giving yourself the tools to put the devil back a little bit and say, right, okay, yeah, I hear you, but actually I have to wait and see, and knowing your body. So but part of, I think, all of that seesaw is knowing that it happens and not letting it get too much out of control, and saying this is just part of life. We seesaw all the time, but how do I rein that back in again? How do I sort of control it and get it back to being rational?
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in there. The models, the kind of psychological models in health psychology we use of coping when someone is coping is up and down. That's what it. I don't like the word should, but that's what we anticipate it looking like. That's you nailing it. That's it going well. We expect it to look up and down like this. I've done one of these before, and I think all of my colleagues will tell you I sound like I'm obsessed with self-care, but self-care is don't laugh at me, Kate.
Yes, I love self-care. Yes.
Completely agree with you.
Self-care is the thing that Kirsty's talking, well, to my mind, is one of the things that Kirsty's talking about that gives you the strength to be able to do that. And I think I blame society. We have an idea that self-care is in some way self-indulgent. It's about having a facial or a massage, and it's something that snotty people do because they're self-absorbed. That's not true. Self-care is the thing that gives you the psychological buffer to be able to cope with life. A whole bunch of it is the unfun stuff, like going to bed at a decent time, making sure that you're eating right, exercising, not looking at a screen before you go to bed, all those boring things, but things that help keep us balanced. And it's also the things that I think Kirsty was talking about when she was talking about being brave and going to see people. There's an idea that we have these 3 different drives, and the soothe drive that we get into that brings us back down, that puts the brakes on the anxiety, is one of the things that really triggers it. Things like having a cuddle, stroking a cat, being around loved ones, and putting those kind of things into your life. It's not self-absorbed or, you know, being precious. And, you know, if going for a massage is what makes you feel better and you're able to do that, then great. That's something that needs to be prioritized, not happen when you have time, because it's doing those things that allow you to self-soothe, that allow you to ride that up and down wave so that you're surfing rather than being drowned.
It's just a way of regaining control, isn't it? All this, we're not, I could go on for days and days about this, but we don't support patients particularly well in haematology because we're an acute service, but we don't support our patients who are now living longer with chronic conditions as to how to better manage. And all these self-care is just taking back control and managing their disease and having control over their disease and getting to learn, you know, to live with it like people do with diabetes and cardiac. They're all set up for it, and we're only just learning that in haematology. So it's such a healthy thing to do.
Completely agree, and I could not promote self-care more. So really appreciate bringing that into the conversation, and actually really interesting that you touched on the kind of more chronic conditions. There's been a question in the chat around CLL, and someone just mentioning that their first thoughts were panic, but actually they've been put on a watch and wait, or as they call it, watch and worry pathway. So just questioning kind of how is the best way to deal with this ongoing process. It sounds like some of the previous answers would ring true in that. Is there anything you would add? Maybe Kirsty first.
That's because I was off mute, wasn't it? I was like, oh,
yes, it was.
I'm jumping to get into this.
Looked like you were ready.
This, I think, I feel with, maybe rightly or wrongly, but I feel with a lot of the chronic blood disorders, there's less support. There feels like there's less support out there for people. They don't have the people to turn to, maybe to ask questions, and we're busy with the acute patients. The patients are on the ward, and actually I think a lot of the time people who are trying to fit in a new diagnosis such as CLL, such as PV with their life, need a little bit of support on how to manage that and how to, there is a watch and worry, and people feel as though sometimes it can be a time bomb that's waiting to go off, but it's been able just to say there are people that are there to help with that. There are Blood Cancer UK, often nurse specialists are there. A lot of what I do is about the chronic conditions because I'm really interested in the impact that they have on people and being able to guide people with them, because if you don't feel that there's anybody to turn to ask questions, they then escalate. So if you just have somebody that can just help back up the truck a little bit and say, actually, things are looking good, and if it's just a little bit of reassurance that people need, that's okay. And it's the watch and wait, I think, is really, really difficult. And the longer it goes on for, the easier it gets. But you can't underplay, and we can't as healthcare professionals underplay the impact that has on you psychologically, that knowing that you're having your bloods done and the reliance that we put on bloods, and particularly when people are well. So it's a huge area, but there's just lots of support out there just to help manage it, just to help get through.
And I think something that I've noticed in particular around this on our Blood Cancer UK community forum, there is a lot of support. There are a lot of similar issues, but also people who've lived with watch and wait, lived with that anxiety just before an appointment, and other areas, actually supporting each other. That peer support is incredibly valuable. So if you're somebody who is adjusting to that care pathway, or somebody who's particularly anxious right now, then there's lots and lots of support on there that could be really helpful
And
for you.
That's why I love this book, because it's as a healthcare professional, I can only say, this is what happened with one of my patients. I can guide you in this, that, and the next thing, but I just can't put myself in your shoes completely. And I think that peer support is vital, and knowing that, just sometimes knowing that there are other people out there, because these are such rare conditions, and often people will go to their GP surgery, and the GP surgery's maybe never dealt with anybody, so you feel really alone. And just knowing that there's other people out there that you can talk to, that's often enough for people, just to say, oh, I'm not alone, there's somebody out there that gets me, that gets this.
Couldn't agree more. Incredibly valuable. So I wanted us to move a little bit onto treatment, actually, kind of adjustment to treatment at this point. So there's somebody who has asked a question around stem cell transplants. So they've read a lot about side effects, survival rates, and we get lots of people who have read huge amounts before they contact us, and potentially their healthcare professionals as well. So many questions, but they've said that they're not sure that they want to go through with the treatment, and it's yet another life-changing decision that I need to make by myself. And they've ended that with, am I going to survive? And obviously that's a very difficult, impossible question for you to answer, Kirsty, but maybe focusing on the kind of how you make that decision about a treatment and adjust to that. And how would you respond to that?
That's such a hard thing to do by yourself, and I think that's the thing to see, is that you're not alone in this. And it might not be somebody that you know that can help you, but there are there's buddies, people who have been through transplants, people who have got through the other side. My caveat is always, when I'm telling people about treatment, is, have you read the inside of a paracetamol, the patient information leaflet for paracetamol? The side effects of that would scare the living bejesus out of you. But a lot of the time, people take it without thinking about it. And years ago, we were in an era where we didn't give as much information, and you didn't really have a choice, a say in what was going to happen to you. Now we're in the era where you have loads of information, all the potential side effects, and then the option is left for you. And I think that's really hard, but I think it's being able to speak to other people who have been through it. Sometimes the bad thing about the press is that we're not a Disney. We don't like good stories, so a lot of the bad stories are perpetuated, so all you hear is people who haven't done well. So it's speaking to people who have maybe been through it and getting a realistic approach. And we've had this at a support group recently, and we had two people who'd been through transplant, and one who's had a miserable time and one who's had absolutely nothing. And it's knowing that there are extremes, but that person needs to speak to people just to make the right decision for them, and not do it through fear, not do something through fear. Do it knowing that if they go through it, that yes, it might be difficult, but there will be people there to help you and to hold your hand through it and to talk you through what's going to be happening. So not to stop it because they're scared. Just look out there. Anthony Nolan are great for support for buddies, for people who have been through transplant. So there's loads of people who have lived it and that you can talk to get help with that.
We just had a question, actually, I might put it to you, Christian, come through on the chat. It's just around provision of counselling for some of those major life decisions, such as a stem cell transplant. Would you be able to talk to that at all?
Yes, but it will be service. It will depend on the service you're in. So within the NICE guidelines, it says you should have, certainly in my service we did, you could see a counsellor or a psychologist for anything you wanted to, but if someone was being worked up to have a transplant, they had to have a psychological assessment. That was part of it. I think what Kirsty was saying was it makes a lot of sense. Again, when I said at the beginning that your emotions are good servants but terrible masters. So because you're scared, it doesn't mean you shouldn't be scared. It also doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. But that's a very different decision to one where you have the information, you've weighed it up, and you've decided it is not the course of treatment you want to go down, because that is perfectly legitimate. And of course, it's your choice to make that. But like Kirsty says, if it's made out of fear, then you're responding to your emotional response rather than you as an individual. And I know I keep talking about emotions as if they're not part of you, and of course they are, but sometimes it can be helpful to think of them as slightly separate, because they're a biological response which is designed for when we were living with saber-toothed tigers running around. There are certain things that we're triggered by that are meant to make us scared and meant to make us just want to leave. But that's because threats looked different for when our alarm system and that fear and anxiety, it was designed for us living in a different time, and we're not there anymore. So unfortunately, we have to find a slightly different way of dancing with those emotions at the moment. So yes, you should have access to counselling. It will depend on your service. There are psychological services you can access through Macmillan, I think, if your local service doesn't have it. Otherwise, your GP can put you in contact with IAP, which is increased access to psychological therapies. They're relatively quick. And again, having someone who can help you pull apart those bits. What's fear? What's what I want? What's the unknown? It can be really helpful. And like Kirsty says, your team really is there to help you make the decision, and not feeling like you're on your own, I think, makes that a bit easier.
I would also say that as well, actually a bit of fear is not, I think if people enter into these things without really having a bit of fear about it as well. So I think, again, it's a healthy thing to be scared or something like that, but be able to open about it and talk about it. Because I often find that as the nurse looking after some of these patients, that it's easier to manage if people are open and vocal about their fear. That's much easier to manage than people who seem to be just cracking on and getting on with it, because I worry that they're going to fall apart at some time later. So I think having that fear is a healthy thing, and it is just being able to balance it out to the right decision for the person.
Thank you. That was incredibly useful, and I think something that would a lot of the guidance that you gave there would be relevant for anybody who's approaching a decision about any kind of treatment. Obviously, stem cell transplants are very intense, and they require a lot of that thought process. But any change to treatment or starting treatment is a really difficult time for people to adjust to. So some really useful information there. We have got lots more questions to get through, but I just want to ask one. I want to get one more in before we have to wrap up. And actually, this is something that I think maybe there's not enough attention on and enough information and support around. And it's about coping after treatment and coping whilst in remission, or living with a long-term condition after that period of adjustment to what your life looks like now. There's one particular question, Christian, that I wanted to come to you with. So they've said, I'm not sure I'm coping being out of hospital. It sounds weird, but now I'm technically cured, I feel less able to cope than when I was in hospital. And they asked, does anyone else feel like this? So just, Christian, to you, is there any advice that you would give to somebody who's maybe in remission or reaching a new period where they're not in hospital as much?
First of all, I would say this is completely normal. This is really common. I'm not saying that people like being in hospital, but it's cared for, you're looked after. There are awful things that could happen, but you're in the right place. A number of people I've worked with, a huge amount of people I worked with actually, who at some stage have ended up in intensive care. They felt awful there. They didn't want to be in intensive care, but all of a sudden coming back into a ward where you don't have a one-to-one nurse, let them feeling see, and it's called the head and heart disconnect, where logically it doesn't make sense to you. You're like, but I'm better. but your heart's going, oh no, don't like it, don't like it. It's perfectly normal, and it's about the support network that you've got. I also think what's important is when we don't as a species process things when we're in the middle of them. When you're in the eye of the storm, your head is down and you are getting on with what I've got to do now to survive. And it's not until after you've been through the experience that you have the headspace to be able to think about and process what's happened to you. So I wonder as well if there's something going on with only now perhaps realizing how unwell you were, or how at risk you've been, or all the things you've come through, because now you're in a position where you can think about some of those things. And as well, as I was talking about before, that kind of readjustment to who am I, and feeling like that bit of you that's got lost, because I knew who I was before I was unwell, but now I've just done 9 months of treatment and I'm not sure I recognize myself. Who am I? Can this person cope? Can they manage? That's all. When I say it's normal, I don't mean it's easy. I just mean it makes sense. This isn't you going mad. This is a very understandable psychological process that's happening. If you can talk to your medical team about it, of course, I think therapy is going to help, because I think it helps with everything. That self-care, going back to what do I need to help me ride those waves. I think they're very normal processes, and my guess would be the question that's come through is about, you're only just getting the time and the space to realize what you've been through, and now you're starting to process it. And that fear of I've lost who I was, well, that person's still there. It's just perhaps it's a person with an extra layer, and it's about finding out how those things enmesh. I was well, I was ill, now I'm well again. Who am I? And it's about mixing, kind of realizing that those it's still one and the same person. It's just how those kind of experiences mix together. Sorry, that was a messy answer.
No, but covered it a lot there, Christian, in a really short amount of time. So I really appreciate that. We have just hit 7 o'clock. I can't believe that hour went so quickly. I do want to just give our, all of our panelists just one last chance to just summarize, or if there's a piece of advice that they would want to give somebody who's struggling with that adjustment to change. I haven't asked you to pre-prepare this, so don't worry if you haven't got any nuggets of wisdom, but just to go around the room, is there anything that anybody would want to leave our audience with tonight?
They're not alone. They're not alone in this. Sorry. And they're not alone. There's somebody out there who's going through it, has been through it. There's people that can signpost you to other people. So it's not to think that you are in this alone. It's to, if you've not been directed to the help and you have to go and look for it, there are lots of really useful websites, but go and ask and somebody will be able to say this is where you need to look, so that you know that there are other people out there for you.
Thank you, Kirsty. Vidge?
Yeah, it's I feel out of place in terms of me not being a medical professional, but I spend the whole of this session just nodding my head, just saying, do you know what? They get it, and that's it. And so anyone who has been newly diagnosed, like Kirsty and Christian have done so well in terms of hitting the nail on the head of coping with this, and that although I'm on this, but just listening to everything, it meant a lot, and I'm hoping that others feel the same. And obviously, just to make use of the charity, and there is, and like what's been echoed, is the support is there. You are not alone is probably the most important thing, and there is always going to be someone on our side to support you.
Thank you, Vidge. Christian?
And I suppose I would say, coming back to that value base, you're not, I think often people, of course you feel shaken and things feel confusing and different. This isn't the defining feature about you. This is something that you are currently managing, and all the strengths and networks and skills that you've used your entire life, I think sometimes they can get a bit lost, but they're still there. It's just sometimes you have to remind yourself they're there, but you know, you're still you're just dealing with something really difficult.
Thank you so much to all of you. That was incredibly useful. I hope everybody who's listening has taken something from today's session. I'm sure taken a lot from today's session, regardless of your circumstances. If you want to follow up on any of these points or talk through anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact us on 0808 2080 888 or support@bloodcancer.org.uk. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.